So good morning, everyone. Thank you all for joining us early on a Saturday. It's my pleasure to welcome you all to this fireside chat, attending to culture, history, assimilation, and belonging in Latinx immigrant mental health. So I want to start by thanking Zocalo Health for sponsoring this conversation. Zocalo is a new tech-enabled integrated care model that aims to be a trusted source for healthcare within the Latinx community to help overcome barriers and challenges to accessing primary care and achieving wellness. So thank you to Zocalo. And so my name is Isabel Torres, and I'm a committee member of the Women's Mental Health Conference. I am Asian Latina, and so I grew up in Utah, where my Ecuadorian father met my Japanese mother. And my dad, Papi, came to Utah on an educational scholarship in the 1980s. When funding for his scholarship dissolved suddenly, he mowed lawns to finish his undergraduate degree, eventually obtaining a green card, and in the early 2000s, after my brother was born, full US citizenship. So this is a snippet of my family's history and immigration story. And today we are honored to be joined by Julissa Arce, writer, activist, and social change maker whose own immigration story comprises her nationally best-selling book, My Underground American Dream, and motivates her work to fight for social justice, immigrants' rights, and education equality. Julissa's writing has appeared in the New York Times, Time Magazine, CNN, CNBC, Vogue, and other outlets. She is co-founder of the Ascend Educational Fund, a college scholarship and mentorship program for immigrant students in New York City, and she serves on the board of directors of the National Immigration Law Center. Her newest book, released in March, titled You Sound Like a White Girl, The Case for Rejecting Assimilation, discusses the myth that assimilation leads to happiness and belonging for immigrants in America. So welcome, Julissa.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah. So I know that I have had the immense privilege of getting to know a little bit about you through your story and your family, through all of your writing that you've done, and through all of your books. But for those who haven't maybe had a chance to read some of your work, would you mind starting by telling us just a little bit more about yourself?
Yeah, sure. So I was born in Mexico, born and raised in Mexico in a town called Tasco Guerrero, which is just this beautiful, beautiful place. And when I was 11 years old, my parents brought me to live with them in the US because they had been in the US since I was 3. And they would go back and forth, but eventually they started spending a lot more time in the US than in Mexico. So they brought me to live with them when I was 11. And then when I was 14, my visa expired, and that's when I became undocumented. And when I was 14 and found this out, it didn't quite register like what it would mean for my future. It wasn't until applying for college that I realized that this was going to be a really big problem. My immigration status, I mean, and eventually I was able to go work on Wall Street. I worked at Goldman Sachs for 7 years and took a year off, and then worked at Merrill Lynch for 2 more years. So in total, I was on Wall Street for about 10 years before I became a writer and decided that I wanted to share this story. And this is a very abbreviated version of that story, right? There was a lot of hardship during that story, but there was also a lot of sort of hanging on to any piece of joy that I could, because it was very difficult being undocumented. My dad passed away when I was in the US and he was back in Mexico. And so I didn't get to see my dad alive again. And that was a really, really hard thing. And eventually I did become a US citizen in 2014. But I think by that time, I had been through so much that I couldn't quite just enjoy the fact that now I had this thing that I had wanted for so long. And now, as you mentioned in my bio, I'm a writer. I've written and published 3 books. My Underground American Dream, Someone Like Me, which is a young adult version of my story, and my latest book, You Sound Like a White Girl, where I sort of it's sort of a bit of a departure from my previous work as memoirs, because this new book is not a memoir, though there are some personal stories. And now here I am talking to you on a Saturday morning.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing. I know that very abbreviated version, having gotten to read all of it. But can you tell us a little bit more about this newest book? Because I know you structured it into sort of two parts, and then you also interwoven like a ton of history into this book. Yeah, so can you give us just like the briefest overview of,
Yeah, so You Sound Like a White Girl, as you said, it's divided in two parts. The first part is about dismantling the lies of assimilation, the lie of English, the lie of success, the lie of whiteness, and I'll tell you a little bit about them. But then the second part of the book is about reclaiming all of the things that I feel like I lost while I was assimilating in many ways. And when I first started writing the book, I did start writing it as a series of personal essays. So just sort of my own experience with assimilation. But I very quickly realized that in order for these things to really land, right? Like I could talk about how learning English didn't give me a sense of belonging, and how traumatizing it was to learn English, because my teachers and my peers, not all of my teachers, but some of my teachers and many of my peers, viewed me as someone who was not smart because I didn't speak English. And so they sort of put me in this category of someone who didn't get it. And I was a very smart kid. Like I've always really enjoyed school, actually. And so it was quite traumatizing to learn how to speak English, right? And so I started writing an essay about that. But then I started to think about the historical reasons and the historical aspects of my struggles with English, and I learned a lot of things that I never learned in school. Things like how English was used to segregate Mexican students and other Latino students. And so something like 80% of schools in Texas and California were segregated between white schools and Mexican schools. And English was the thing that was used as sort of a reason to segregate these students. Later I learned, because many Latinos often hear, well, if you don't speak Spanish, then you're not Latino enough, right? You can't quite claim that Latino-ness if you don't speak English. And it's like, okay, but do we understand the reason why so many Latinos don't speak English? And it has a lot to do with the discrimination that many people faced in the past and continue to face for speaking Spanish, right? And so before, it was kids would get physically struck for speaking English in the hallways or for speaking English in the classroom. And so many parents made the choice not to teach their kids Spanish. So there's a lot of historical and structural reasons for our struggles today with English and with Spanish. And so I wanted to write about that, and I wanted to learn a lot about the history. And with every one of these lies that I mentioned, success and whiteness, there's quite a bit of history there. And so in the second half of the book, I talk about reclaiming our history and learning that history, and what it did for me to reclaim that history. It really helped me to understand that not only do I belong in this country, but the roots that connect me to Mexico are the same roots that connect me here. And I no longer feel like I'm the one who's not supposed to be here. Like I am supposed to be here, and I can't claim this place and this country as my home. And so in order to do that, I had to go back, and I had to do a lot of research, and I had to read a lot of history, particularly revisionist history, that really tried to capture so much of what was left out in books that were written by white historians.
Yeah, thank you for sharing all of that. It was really a privilege and a pleasure to get to read so much of that, and so much of that history that I certainly didn't learn in school, that I certainly didn't know even before picking up your book. something that sort of struck me that you talked about a little bit just right there was about this component of language. And you have this really nice quote in your book that says, like, quote, being Latino in America means you're held to an impossible standard to prove that we're both sufficiently American and authentically Latino. And I'm curious, like, if you could speak a little bit more about, how you navigated not feeling like enough of either culture, because I think that's something that, like, even beyond being Latina, like, is an experience that a lot of individuals have in the US whose parents might have immigrated from somewhere, or who might be first generation born, that, like, they're somewhere between two cultures perhaps, and, like, not quite feeling like they fit in either of them. So I'm curious a little bit about, like, how you thought about that, but also sort of its impact on your mental health and well-being, and how you eventually arrived to this place. I love this quote as well that you have of, I don't live between two cultures, but I am both.
Yeah. Thank you for that question. So the title of the book, right? You Sound Like a White Girl. That title has there's a whole story behind the title, right? From, like, when somebody told me for the first time I sounded like a white girl, and feeling proud at the moment. Like, when this guy told me I sounded like a white girl, I felt proud. I felt like I've achieved something, because I had tried for so long to enunciate my words so that I could get rid of my accent, so that people wouldn't look down upon me because I had an accent. But then later on, people also started using "you sound like a white girl" as sort of to make a distinction between their Latinidad and mine, right? Making me feel like I was not authentically Latina because I spoke a certain way, or because I dressed a certain way, or whatever other reasons people had in their minds. And you're right that it's interesting, because I never felt like I was not Latina enough or Mexican enough. Like, in my bones, in my body, I am, and I think that's where that why I wrote that sentence. Like, I don't live between cultures, because I used to get asked a lot of questions about, well, how do you navigate living between two cultures? And I just started to think, I don't, it's not like my cultures are outside of me. It's not like my Latinidad lives here and my American lives here, and then I live here. Those two things are in me, and I am those things, and I also get to choose and make culture, right? Like, all of us get to make culture, and all of us get to decide what parts of our culture we want to embody and take on, and which parts are not useful to us anymore. Because there are parts about our culture that need to change. And so it took a lot of self-reflection. And to your question about how does it affect your mental health, like, it affects it affected my mental health quite a bit, because there was this constant pursuit of belonging. And that's why I think that assimilation is so harmful and dangerous for immigrants and people of color, because what it does is that we're constantly trying to fit into a mold that somebody else created, right? And as we are detaching from our culture in order to belong in America, I feel like, are left in this no man's land, where we never quite reach that Americanness, while at the same time we've gotten farther and farther away from our own culture, our own heritage, our own language. And so we're left in this no man's land that made me feel very empty, that made me feel like I was not good enough, and always sort of seeking the approval of white people, frankly, of seeking the approval of white spaces. And eventually I had to come to the realization that I was, no matter what I did, no matter how much money I made, no matter how I spoke English, no matter what fancy clothes I was wearing, there were still going to be some people that looked at me and would feel like I didn't belong here. And that was a really big shift into thinking, why am I trying so hard for these people that I don't even know, that like, they don't care about me. And so like, why am I trying so hard to get their approval? And eventually I sort of really started to look inward. And that was, writing this book. And I write this in You Sound Like a White Girl, that this book was so necessary for my own healing, right? Writing this book was such a healing process of being able to put myself back together from all of the things that I had lost. And I say that at some point I felt like I became a Frankenstein, right? Just like all these different pieces. And it's been a challenging journey at times, but being on the other side of writing this book, I feel like, okay, I have reclaimed these things, and I feel more like myself than I did before.
Yeah. I was going to ask you, like, sort of what were the ways in which you cultivated like a different, more accepting understanding of your position, like, as you said, not between two cultures, but like reconciling those both as really internal to you. But it sounds like some of that took place as you were writing the book itself. And I think having read it, and also like myself being in a strange place of having multiple cultures, I found like that journey alongside you, which was very beautiful, and like I'm very grateful to you for, and probably like countless other people who read this and see themselves in it in some way, like see pieces of their story and like their, some experience of them like not fitting into school, right? Or like someone making an offhand comment to them that only later, I think, do we realize, wait, that, like that, no, that,
Yeah.
Right. And so, but I'm curious, like, if there have been other ways that you've really cultivated belonging, like within yourself or amidst your community too, in addition to writing, perhaps.
Yeah. So one of the biggest ways in which I have been able to reclaim has been to learn the history of my people in this country, because there's so much that we don't know, that so the one thing that's really sort of complex about the Latino community, right, is that there are Latinos who are immigrants like myself. I came here from Mexico, and then there are Latinos who have been here since, Mexicans specifically, since before it was called the United States, right? That were living in Texas and California and New Mexico when it was Mexican land, that lived there when it was before it was colonized by the Spanish. And so there's also Latinos who have never been immigrants, and yet so much of our Latino identity is tied to immigration and to an immigration journey, even though many people have not experienced that journey. And I think part of it is part of that sort of constant waves of migration. At the same time that there's generations and generations of Latinos in the United States, it creates sort of this very complex dynamic for how we understand our position in this country. And also what Dr. Laura E. Gomez, this professor from UCLA, writes, that also makes us like perpetual foreigners in this country, right? We're like constantly viewed as foreigners, even if we've been here for a long time. And so going back and learning the history, because I was always curious, like, where were we when the civil rights movement was happening? Where were we when I had this question about like, where did Mexicans go to school? And that's how I learned about this segregation of Mexican and white schools, because I'd never learned about that. I was curious, like, what were we doing when the civil rights movement was happening, and sort of learning about the Chicano movement that was happening at the same time, and not just sort of like the Chicano movement, but the ways in which the Chicano movement and the civil rights movement were sort of working together to get rights for everybody. But I never learned about those things, you know. And so I think that a big part of me cultivating a sense of belonging was understanding just what a big role all Latinos have played in the history of the United States, just how influential we have been to the culture of the United States. And once I started learning these stories, you know, these stories of people, you know, some of those people are still alive today and we don't know their stories. And they're there, you know, these elders, these people, they're here for us to like ask questions of them, for us to learn about their struggles and the advances that they made, and in the ways in which sometimes I think some of these people feel like, what difference did we make if we're still struggling with the same things, right? And it's sort of like reiterating to them that like, I have felt so inspired by their stories, and it has given me that sense of belonging that they were seeking for themselves, learning about that. So that's been a really big thing, is sort of learning that history, learning those stories, being inspired by the sort of leaders of the past, and also learning about the mistakes that they made and how we can sort of build upon the things that they did in a way that is more intersectional, in a way that is not rooted in sort of machismo, because so many of those movements in the past have been. And so but that sort of, to answer your question, really history for me has been a big way in which I've cultivated belonging. And then the other way is in the ways in which I assert myself in any room that I walk into. You know, I think so many times we do this sort of like code switching, you know, and like we act one way and we dress one way and we do certain things when we're in certain spaces, but not when we go in other spaces. And I just didn't want to do that anymore. Like, I just wanted to be able to take my whole entire self, like anywhere that I went, every day, because otherwise I just felt very fragmented, and I didn't want to do that anymore. So yeah, I think those are the two ways that I can share.
Yeah, thanks. You to that like second piece about, first of all, I'm inspired by that, and I should like take some of that into my own personal life too. But I think like you have this sentence about pearl earrings, right, in like the professional context, and I think for a lot of people who might be watching this webinar, who are with us today, who are like working in different professional, like clinical contexts, that idea that there is like a certain way of being professional in the world is like definitely really damaging.
Yeah. And there's a history to it, you know, all of these things. That's what I mean. That's why history is so important, because it's like somebody at some point decided, right, that pearl earrings were considered professional. And a big part of that is because real pearls, right? Like real pearls are very expensive. And so, you know, back in the day, only people with money, only people with a title could afford to wear pearls. And so that's what sort of became viewed as it was a very elitist place, right, where I think professionalism, what we consider professionalism, comes from a very elitist place. Right? And those, many of those rules are antiquated, because who says that my big hoop earrings are not professional, right? Who's to say that like the art that's on my nails is not professional? Like, this is art, you know, and this is my culture on my nails, and I want to bring them with me in every professional space that I go into. Now, I think that sometimes these sort of questions about diversity and inclusion and equity, like I feel like so much of the stress of those things ends up on our shoulders, when really it should be on employers, right? Because I think that many times they say, yes, we want to be inclusive, we want to give you a seat at the table, but it's like, okay, but can I come to that table with my full self, or am I going to be even though I'm at the table, so now you can pat yourself in the back to say you're being inclusive. But now that I'm at that table, if I can't actually be myself and move up the, the corporate ladder and get promoted and be viewed as a professional, then I'm not really being included.
Right.
Then this table is not actually inclusive. And a lot of that work needs to happen at the employer level, because it shouldn't then add extra stress to us to find belonging in those spaces. They should be welcoming spaces. And many times, despite the best efforts, maybe they're not the best efforts, but despite the efforts of companies, they fall short.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. There's definitely like such a difference between inclusion and then like actually having voice. And not only voice, like there's also that difference between like, oh yes, you can speak at this table, but like having equal shared power at that table. Yeah. So something that like I've been really curious about and sort of grappling with, related to the intersection of like identity, culture, and mental health, has been sort of like what it means for us to be able to have discussions about mental health, which in some ways feels like a privileged discussion, right? And so there's this other quote in your book from Hassan Minhaj, right, the comedian, who says like, I think the biggest difference
it's Hassan Minhaj.
Hassan Minhaj.
Minhaj. No, it's not Minhaj. Minhaj. And I only make a big deal out of it because that's why he's in the book, because of how he made, like a really big deal about Ellen pronouncing his name correctly. So it's Minhaj.
Minhaj. Yes.
Yeah.
And so thank you for that too.
Yeah.
Right, absolutely. He says, like, I think there's a big difference between our parents' generation and our generation, where like they were always trying to just survive in this country, and I'm trying to live. And I think that difference between like survival and living captures like what like I have felt, and I have heard friends have felt too, like a really big generational gap between like parents who immigrated to the US and their children, whether or not they were born here or they immigrated with their parents at a young age, that like being able to attend to our well-being only comes after like a certain level of security and survival has been achieved. And so I think what I've seen just like in my world and experience is that maybe for the first time, like Latinx young adults or children are like starting to really open up this box of family history and family trauma, maybe too, in a way that maybe their parents like never grappled with or were never able to attend to because they were trying to survive in this country. And so I'm curious, like with that in mind, the sort of like where some young adults might be now in terms of, accessing that history, in terms of reclaiming pieces of their identity. Like, what do you feel like is really important for clinicians, like mental health clinicians, to know? Or like, what do you feel like they need to understand in order to be able to provide like better mental health care?
Yeah, I definitely do think that there is a very critical and important cultural component that needs to be a big part of mental health and how clinicians deal with different or interact with different patients, right? Because I've been to therapy and have had different therapists, and there were definitely times when my first therapist was a white woman who I really loved. Like, she was a great therapist, but there were definitely times when some of the feedback she would give me, she was not understanding how culturally that was like a really difficult thing. The things she was suggesting that I do, like, for example, it was sort of like, you've got to create this like boundaries, right? We talked a lot about boundaries. Like you gotta create this boundaries. And so like when your family's asking for this, you just need to say no and like create that boundary. And I'm like, yes, but that sounds like a good idea, but that's not something I can do. That's not something I can do right now. So like, is there a step in between these things that I can take? Like, is there a different approach given how culturally impossible it feels sometimes to create those boundaries with family members, to create those boundaries with our parents, right? And so, and because sometimes, to be honest, I would feel more stressed out coming out of therapy and feeling like not only am I, dealing with all these emotions and dealing with all these mental health issues, but now I feel stressed that I'm letting my therapist down because I'm not doing the things that she's asking me to do, and that I maybe are good for my mental health, but I can't do them. And so now I'm like stressed about going to therapy and having to tell her, no, I did not say no, or I did not create this boundary. Or so I think so there has to be a very big cultural component to things. And something that you mentioned about sort of being almost like a privilege that we get to not deal with, but that we get to explore, that we get to take care of our mental health in a way that our parents never did, right? Like last night I was at dinner with some friends, and so they were telling me about it's the first time that they're leaving, that they took a trip without their child, and they talked to the sort of like, they talked to their therapist about how do we create a healthy attachment with our child, and how do we make this feel safe for our child? How do we make sure that the child knows like we're coming back to them, we're not just like leaving? And I was just so impressed by that, because I thought, when my parents left me in Mexico, I do not think that they ever were asking themselves, how do we do this in a healthy way where it's not going to create trauma for our child? And I just thought, wow, that's like incredible, and it's incredible that we're at this point where we can think about those things, where we can have conversations about some of, about attachments, about how do we create healthy relationships with our partners in a way that our parents never did. And by the way, sometimes it's like a difficult conversation to have with our parents because they never thought about those things. And so thinking about those things sometimes to them feels like bougie, right? Like white people stuff, like right. White people go to therapy. That's not for us. We don't have that luxury. And sort of trying to also explain to our parents that these things are real. They're not, I remember so many times telling my mom about how I was feeling, and she would just say, it's just in your head. It's just in your head. And it's like, okay, yeah, maybe it is just in my head, but because it is in my head, now it's like a real thing, being in my head makes it real. And so I'm kind of just going on because it's a very difficult thing to navigate sometimes, not just dealing with our own, and I keep using this word dealing, and I don't think it's the right word, but it's not just about us addressing our own mental health, but then it's the added stress of explaining it to our parents and trying to close that generational gap of things that they may not understand or they might not think are important, but we are at a place where we know that they are important. And so sometimes there's got to be smaller steps. So going back to sort of like, what can clinical psychologists do? Like, I think that there has to be an understanding that different cultures are going to address things differently, and what might feel easier for one person might be very, very difficult for another. And I do think that needs to be a consideration when advice is given, and an understanding that it might be one step for one person, but for another person, you might need 5 steps before you get to that big one. In order for it to actually be helpful for our mental health instead of adding more stress.
Yeah. Or like even sometimes I think like not even the sequential steps, right? But like first I got to step like way over here.
Right.
To
Yeah.
even, like, start to move in that direction as well.
And having these conversations is really helpful, by the way. You know, like I think for a long time I was I didn't want to talk about the fact that, you know, I went to therapy, or I think there's still this stigma around people who use like anxiety medication. And, you know, maybe we're like, okay, we're okay with therapy, but like medication, I don't think so. And sometimes like that is what somebody needs, you know? And I think the more that people talk about it, the more normal it will become, right? The more that other people will be able to feel like there's nothing wrong with you because you're going to therapy. There's nothing wrong with you if you need anxiety medicine or depression medicine. Like, thankfully, modern science has created these things for us to take advantage of.
Yeah. And I think it's also sort of, yeah, that's like another piece of like acceptance beyond like acceptance within, maybe this is getting too profound, beyond like re-accepting and like reclaiming our culture, but also just accepting like, or which I think is a really challenging thing depending on like the family dynamics and like the family you grew up with, accepting also like what we need to care for ourselves that might look really different, or like does look really different than maybe what our parents needed or like thought we would need to as their children. Okay, so we're sort of coming up on time, and I want to leave like maybe the last 5 minutes for questions or so. I know we have some individuals who are monitoring those questions in the background, but I was wondering if there's anything that anything to either like encourage people to do who might be watching this conversation with respect to like learning the history, or anything that you would want to leave attendees with today, in terms of like how they can go about reclaiming those pieces of themselves that might feel more fragmented at this time, might feel like, how do I begin to put all of that together in a way that you did so beautifully in your writing?
Thank you. Well, I think my book is a good starting point. You know, and I don't just say that like self-serving, but but that is why I wrote this book, right? I wrote this book so that it could create some sort of roadmap, and not a guide, because it's not a how-to book. Although I've been surprised to hear some people call it a self-help book, because I never thought of it in that way, like at all. But I do think that, you know, it sort of gives you, the thing I wanted to do with this book is to like create conversations, right? For people to be able to have more conversations about the things that I discuss. And it's sort of a shorter book. It's sort of a tight book, but there is also tons of notes in the back about places that people can start learning more about that history, right? So I definitely encourage people to read those books. Like there's a couple of books that were really helpful to me in understanding that history. One of them is called A Latinx and African American History of the United States by Paul Ortiz. There's another book called Manifest Destinies by Laura Gomez, who I mentioned earlier. And she also wrote a book called Inventing Latinos. So I think like those three books are a really good starting point for understanding the history, and understanding how the Latino identity was formed, who it served, and that's a whole nother conversation. But yeah, I think it's just a matter of sort of like starting to read those books, and then it's about for me, it was like, okay, I read these books, and then reading those books gave me some answers, but it also brought up more questions.
Yeah.
So then it's like, okay, now I need to go read this book to have this question. So the other day, an author friend of mine joked that she had to read 100 books in order to write one book. And I didn't quite read 100 books, but I did read dozens of history books to be able to write this one book and synthesize a lot of that history. But yeah, those 3 books are really are books that I highly recommend. And I would say, think about, what questions do you want to answer for yourself? What are those questions that would help you to reclaim and to feel whole, and then go and try to find those books, because they exist. I think that's the biggest thing, is that sometimes we think that these things don't exist, and they do, and sometimes they are more difficult to find, but they are out there.
Right. They're just not always the first one on the shelf in our school library. Yeah,
that's right.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much for those words and for those resources as well. I think we do have one question that sort of relates to, from the audience, that sort of relates to our conversation about the generational gap between parents and children. It says, people will often criticize how the past generation might have done things or the roads that they decided to take. And I think this is, you talk about this too, that like, even when we look at history, it's not perfect. There are some things that like we might look at today and say like, oh, they did that in a different way, or in a way that like maybe I disagree with from like where we're operating today. And so this question is like, people often criticize the past generations, but they were really dealing with their own struggles at the time. And so how do we get the current generation to understand that? And this is an interesting specific example of like, what comes to mind is Arabs who fought to be counted as white on the census, knowing that they would be treated better. The census is like a whole topic.
Yeah, I mean, there's a whole chapter in the book about the census, and it's interesting, that there are not interesting, but that we know that there are other communities who have tried to be viewed as white in order to seek protection, in order to feel like they belong. And by the way, like, Mexicans did this too, right? In the 1930 census, there was a category for Mexican as a race, and it's believed that that data was then used to deport millions of Mexicans who were actually U.S. citizens. And so many people then fought for Mexicans to also be viewed as white. Right? And I think that the question is very interesting, because the way that I talk about this is that we have to be gentle in the way that we explain things to our parents. We have to be gentle in the way that we view past generations to understand their motivations, right? But at the same time, what I have learned in my own life and in the historic research that I have done, is that every single time that our communities have tried to seek protection and seek belonging by proximity to whiteness, it has never worked. It has always backfired on us. Like, who cares if you can check that you're white on a form, if when you walk out into the world, you are not viewed as white and you are not given the rights or the privileges of white that white people have. And so yes, I understand why their motivations, and I do think that many times that motivation came from a good place. Like, I think sometimes the motivation was not purposefully trying to be anti-Black, purposely trying to be racist or whatever, but the purpose of something and the result and the consequences of something are two different things, right? So I can empathize and understand why Mexicans did things the way that they did, right? By trying to be white on the census, by trying to and it all, I mean, it all goes back to the Mexican-American War and like the fact that Mexicans got citizenship at a time when only white people could, not because the US wanted to, but that's the compromise they had to make in order to steal all the land that they stole from Mexico. So all of these reasons, right? Um, but yes, I've tried to understand the motivations, and also, and then to say, okay, but it hasn't worked. Here we are still trying to fight for these rights. So is there a different strategy that we can take now? Is there something, can we do things differently because it hasn't worked in the past? So, and yeah, you know, if people get a chance to read the book, I think they'll see that I have tried to be very understanding and very gentle in the way in which I talk about past generations and what they had to do in order to survive. Right? Mm-hmm. And I think that the best way to honor that for me is to take the work that they have done and try to not just survive, but to thrive. You know, like I'm tired of just surviving. Like let's take the bar, let's take the sort of like bar and bring it up. Like surviving should not be our goal. Mm-hmm. You know, like let's thrive.
That's a yeah, I like don't want to speak anymore because I feel like that's such a good note to end on. Yeah, it's you do. I think that's one of the things I've admired about your writing and about your activism generally is that it's like it's acting from such a place of grace and like compassion towards yourself and towards others, and recognizing that there is a difference, that like whereas they were trying to do this and it didn't function for them, it didn't achieve what they were trying to do, but yet like you are now in a different place of approaching that with like acceptance and like, yeah, this process of reclaiming and this process of love for our communities. And so I just want to thank you for that. And thank you tremendously for this conversation this morning. I think, yeah, it has given, I know, me so much, and I hope all of the other people on this call this morning today, sort of that courage to go out and be, be authentic.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for bringing up the thing about grace, because, you know, I do think that grace has to be a big part of how we do this, and for us to give each other grace, because you know, I'm not perfect. I am going to disappoint people sometimes with the choices that I make. And that's okay, because, you know, we're all human and we're all just trying to do the best that we can and to learn and to move forward. And if we don't give each other grace, then the work that we're doing to make things better is going to feel so exhausting that it makes people sometimes want to exit that kind of work because of the pressure to just be like perfect all the time. And I think that's a really unfair pressure that we put on each other. So if there's, you know, there's a place to end it, for me, it would be that we have to show each other grace as we are all trying to figure out this thing called life.
Amazing. Yeah. Thank you so much, Julissa.
Thank you. Thank you, and have a great rest of the conference.